better fall again, motherfucker. Hello, bros. We're back with a new book. Well, not a new book, old new book. Classic. Let me take that off the cover. Oh, that makes it worse. Must be the light above making that glare. All right. Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. And the reason why I'm starting it today is because the story begins. Obviously, this is a fictional book, but it begins on May 4th, 1771. And we will go to the beginning and see what it says. There's a short biographical and bibliographical note. I don't think I'm going to read this part, though, because this is just the opening. Introduction. When, in his later years, Goethe recalled the mood in which he wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, he confessed to a feeling of surprise that so young a man should have achieved so explosive and radical a confession. He was not yet 25 when the novel was published in 1774. Apart from an historical play. You see that? An. You always put an before historical. Or any word that is a, what's it, a vowel? Apart from an historical play, Gotts von Berlichingen, Werther was his first major achievement. Its success was instantaneous and indeed so overwhelming that it would be difficult to think of many other works of European fiction which captured the imagination of their own generation with equal intensity. Its fame at the time rested, as Goethe himself somewhat uneasily recognized, not entirely upon its artistic merits. Subtle and impressive though it was, its poetic qualities were not readily acknowledged. Much of its substance, many of its details, were drawn from Goethe's own life, but it portrayed at the same time, with uncanny accuracy, the mood, at once exuberant and despairing, of a generation which had half consciously turned against the manners and beliefs of the earlier 18th century. 2 years before the book was written, Goethe served as an apprentice lawyer at the Supreme Court in Wetzlar. Wetzlar? What? Wetzlar? Wetzlar? I don't know. There he met Charlotte Buff, who expected soon to be married to Johann Christian Kessner, a dull but worthy official 12 years her senior. Do I have this on or no? Yeah, I do. Goethe met her on June 9th, 1770, under circumstances similar to those that brought Werther and Charlotte together. He found himself at once drawn to Charlotte, and for a time attached himself to her, as much, it may be suspected, from a sense of frustration in the confirmed petty bourgeois world of the small town as from a feeling of profound passion. A few months later, on September 11th, he parted from Charlotte and her fiancé on terms of genuine friendship. Shortly afterwards, he received the news of the suicide of K.W. Jerusalem, one of his Wetzlar acquaintances, and this supplied the spectacular incident that was to lead to the writing of the novel. As if in a trance, Werther was written in 4 weeks, without a plan of the whole work or the treatment of any portion of it having previously been put to paper. Goethe used much of the correspondence between himself and Kessner, who had in the meantime married Lot, and drew especially for the second part liberally from accounts which he had been given of the motives and circumstances of Jerusalem's death. Such a combination of truth and fiction was, of course, part of a specific artistic intention, transcending his own personal role in the drama which he hoped to relate. He would convey with all immediacy possible the condition of a supremely sensitive but supremely unstable human being. Werther was to represent the history not only of an unhappy lover, but of a young man who was crushed and destroyed by the unbearable weight of his own passions. That this highly perceptive youth also found himself sadly, even tragically, in conflict with an insensible society, that he could not maintain himself in a world which persisted in its conventional social and emotional habits, must be regarded as a subsidiary, though essential dramatic theme of the novel. No one knew better than the young Goethe how paralyzing such conflicts could be in his life. And in his poetry. He had found no better way in which to show the extraordinary strength of his own youthful feeling and imagination than by a series of emphatic, even fanatical, assertions of the creative freedom of the individual. Goethe's letters of the time, his dithyrambic poetry, and the enthusiastic passages in praise of Shakespeare's genius are sufficient evidence of his rebellious faith. But the stirring effect of the book was by no means due only to its social themes or the sentimental and emotional revelations of a primitive or a private individual. As soon as the novel was published, it seemed to release, as Goethe himself later recognized, a latent disposition among his contemporaries to melancholy and crippling introspection. What was begun as the portrait of a gifted man of feeling turned into a tragedy of sensibility. Yet Werther is no Hamlet, even though the paralysis of the will and overtones of despair, of sickness unto death, may seem to be shared by both. Werther, unlike Hamlet, seeks fellowship. Throughout his early days in the country, he finds himself enchanted by images of the simple life which, in contrast to his disappointing experiences among society, he discovers in the world of Homer and the plain folk of the village. And what appeals to him in Charlotte is not the fire of her love for him, but the natural kindness of her whole being. His growing attachment to her, self centered, demanding, and naive as it is hardly the kind of love which counts on reciprocity. Pardon. It is rather an expression of his craving for a relationship which allows him to live wholly, if egotistically, out of the exuberance of his own emotions. Surely we must not conclude that he gradually surrendered to despair and thoughts of suicide because he realized that there was no hope of his marrying Charlotte. The true reason for the crisis in Werther's life and the cause of his collapse lie not ultimately in the circumstances of this unfulfilled love, but in the incongruities of his own paradoxical nature. With an extravagant faith in the intensity of his feelings, he defies the society of his fellow men. As he realizes the hopelessness of his attempts at communication, he is compelled by a series of inner and outer circumstances to turn from the world. In his despair, he dares altogether to deny its validity and relevance and eventually knows no other escape but to draw ever close to the domain of nature, which is below man as well as above. More than once he declares himself outside the pale of what seems to him the meaningless and disgusting show of society, and by another short step he hopes to achieve a religious or pseudo religious identification of man, nature, and God. There is yet another philosophical paradox in Werther. In the process of realizing his own exaggerated vision of human potentialities, he loses all confidence in the hopeful image of man such as the 18th century had created. He finds himself moved by the enviable figures of outcasts and lunatics who need no longer, as he sees it, to maintain the deceptive disguise of social pretenses. The idyllic and humane world of Homer soon gives way to the violent universe of Ossian, as the benevolently deistic god of the best of all possible worlds loses meaning for Werther. There emerges for him the terrible image of a nature deity whose grand indifference to the petty concerns of man seems the only attitude of the Godhead which the palpable imperfection of man's earthly career will reasonably permit. In the experience of human insufficiency lies ultimately the key to Werther, or is it Werther? The freedom of the human heart, which he so ardently declared at the beginning of his career, and which he continued to assert with such uncompromising faith, is in the end used to accomplish the act of surrender, a voluntary submission to non human, godlike nature. In terms of the dilemma, and I wonder if it is Werther and not Werther, since W's are V's in German. I know Wagner's name was Wagner, not Wagner. So I wonder if it is Werther. Anyway, I'll just say it, Werther, so it sounds like it's both. Werther's suicide only completes the deliberate extinction of the last vestiges of the human personality. It is an act by which the freedom of man to recognize his own frailty and thus to deny the very meaning and validity of his life is dramatically asserted. Read in the light of such ideas, read in the light of such ideas, Werther becomes a work of extraordinary importance to our own time. We too, readers of Joyce and Kafka, are profoundly moved by Werther's ever repeated question after the essence of man: what is the heart? What is the destiny of man? This is the memorable phrase which recurs throughout the book. Werther has no simple and no comforting answer to it. His jubilant faith in the passionate resources of the human being gives way to dejection and despair. There is in Werther much of the cultural pessimism of his age and much of the temperamental impatience of Goethe's own youth, but it is not a document of academic interest only. Its issues are universal. The much talked about age of Werther, said Goethe in a famous conversation with Eckermann on January 2nd, 1824, is not, strictly speaking, a mere historical event. It belongs to the life of every individual who must accommodate himself and his innate and instinctive sense of freedom to the irksome restrictions of an obsolescent world. Happiness unattained, ambition unfulfilled, desires unsatisfied are the defects, not of any particular age, but of every individual human being. It would be a pity indeed if everyone had not once in his life known a period when it seemed to him as if Werther had been written especially for him. If then we take Werther not as a sentimental love story, but as the account of a complex psychological crisis, we shall all the more clearly recognize how deliberately Goethe conveyed its ramified theme. How much longer is this? This goddamn thing's a novel itself. It'll take me 20 pages to get to the fucking novel. It is not a novel in the sense which we attach to the great specimens of 19th century fiction. The area of its actions is circumscribed, and whatever happens in the slight story derives its importance almost slowly from its significance for the psychological drama within Werther. None of the figures surrounding him, not even Charlotte, seem to have anything like the firmness of outline or the vitality of telling detail, which are the essential ingredients in Fielding, Dickens, and Balzac. As Werther loses his grasp of the world, as he longs in the true spirit of the romantic for immersion in the non-human universe, his own mastery of the world, whether in relation to others or to his skill in sketching, decreases and vanishes. I have lost, he confesses in the letter of November 3rd, the only joy of my life, that active, sacred power with which I created worlds around me. It is no more. It is at the point where, for Werther, all tangible reality collapses that Goethe carefully reinforces the narrative structure. He introduces the informed comments of the narrator and thereby gives substance and credibility to what might otherwise evaporate in the effusive monologues of the letters. With remarkable technical mastery, he weaves from beginning to end a distinct pattern of poetic motifs, which mirror as they recur not only the passing seasons, but the emotional attitudes of Werther himself. Whatever literary examples may have been in Goethe's mind, they were carefully absorbed and transformed into a world of striking originality. Certain of its features, the epistolary form, the mixture of lyrical and melodramatic elements, the precision of psychological observation, the exactness of its pathological data, even at times, the irony with which Goethe could not help contemplating the self-pitying utterances of Werther are, of course, foreshadowed in the great writers of the earlier 18th century. Without the contemporary vogue of the melancholy poetry of James Thomson and Edvard Young, without Rousseau, Richardson, Goldsmith, and Sterne, the novel would not have struck its readers with equal force. But its most enchanting quality lies in its lyrical prose, which is incomparably fresh and musical, and which has hardly been excelled by any other German poet. Still, it may console the American reader who cannot enjoy Werther in the original to know that Goethe himself at times preferred to read the novel in translation. Werther was at once translated into several languages, and in Germany and elsewhere became the prototype of a vast body of Wertherian romances. Its effect upon the contemporary public was overwhelming and not seldom disastrous. Poetry was all too crudely transformed into reality, and countless suicides were ascribed to its abhorrent teachings. In Leipzig and Copenhagen, its distribution had to be banned by law. Within a short time after the publication of the novel, a wave of Werther fever had swept Europe. In 1784, a young English lady committed suicide, and a copy of a translation of Werther was found under her pillow. In the announcement of her death, this circumstance was particularly emphasized in order, if possible, to defeat the evil tendencies of that pernicious work. One of the book's most distinguished readers was Napoleon, who carried it in his traveling library throughout his campaigns, and who spoke to Goethe at their meeting in 1808 with uncommon critical understanding of the qualities and defects of the novel. Goethe himself was at first amused and later irritated at the spectacular impression which this novel, which this most personal of his earlier books had created. In a brief prefatory poem to the second printing of Werther, he concluded by urging his readers not to succumb to the fatal mood of the book. Be a man, Werther's ghost exclaims in that poem, nor seek to follow me. In 1782, Goethe undertook the delicate and dangerous task of making a number of significant revisions for a forthcoming edition of his works. He toned down the exuberance of language, placed the figure of Albert in a somewhat more appealing light, and introduced the tragic story of the peasant lad, hoping thereby to throw Werther's own fate into clearer relief. 50 years later, he confessed to Ackermann in the Conversation of 1824 that Werther is a creature which, like the pelican, I fed with my own blood. There is so much of myself in it, so many of my own feelings and ideas that I could have spread it into a novel of 10 volumes. But with his characteristic fear of stirring up old wounds, he could later not often bring himself to reread the book. It is a mass of explosives, and I am uncomfortable when I look at it. I dread lest I should once more experience the pathological state in which I produced it. Goethe was then no longer the restless youth, but even though he had in many respects changed profoundly, it would not be true to say that the issues of Werther had lost their significance for him. On the contrary, its substance, its nearly irreconcilable tension between the creative and irrational powers of the individual and the compulsion of the objective world, continued to be one of the main themes of his life's work. We need only remind ourselves of the anguish of Tasso or Faust as they face the conflict within them of incomparable aspirations and the stubborn realities of the physical and social order. Goethe would not repudiate Werther, but as his life advanced, as his own responsibilities increased and his social philosophy matured, his conception of the function of the irrational underwent a remarkable transformation. In the two great novels dealing with the education of Wilhelm Meister, Apprenticeship 1795 to 96, Travels 1821 1829, and in Elective Affinities 1809. This change from the passionate romanticism of Werther to a more resolutely serene life becomes unmistakably clear. Quite deliberately, he chose later in his life literary forms which should lend themselves to the communication of a more detached and explicitly ethical point of view. Werther was, not only in conception but in its style, the product of a lyrical and dramatic impulse. More and more, Goethe turned later to the various possibilities of objective prose, especially to the reflective and, we may say, parabolical forms of the short narrative. From among the several dozen of these tales, it is not difficult to justify the choice of the two here printed. They illustrate most successfully the turn in Goethe's thinking, and they provide at the same time splendid examples of his talents as a storyteller and prose artist. In some respects, they are related to the 18th century tradition of the cantus moraux and the philosophical and educational motives which produce them. But there is in them, particularly in the novelle, enough of the characteristic admixture of the picturesque and the musical to remind us that Goethe, in spite of his dislike for the diffuseness and catholicity of the Romantic movement, nevertheless shared significantly in the climate of ideas of the early 19th century. The title of the new Melusina, 1817, alludes to the folktale of the water sprite who had married Raymond of Poitiers on condition that he should never see her on a Saturday. Does this have anything to do with Goethe's? Or I'll just read the whole thing. Doesn't matter. On which day she reverted to her mermaid-like condition. He gave way to his curiosity and broke the compact, whereupon she disappeared. What attracted Goethe to this story, which had long been familiar to him, was not only the imaginative freedom of the fairy tale and its formal flexibility, but still more the ethical implications of it. It is one of the three tales inserted in the second half of Wilhelm Meister's Travels, in which the force of passion overwhelms those who allow themselves to yield to it. A loafing young fellow unexpectedly and rather undeservedly meets a beautiful woman. He is promised her love and her fortune if he will restrain his instability and impatience. Regardless of his good intentions, he fails to keep his pledge. He is forgiven, but fails again and is put to ever more severe tests. One day he discovers, in spite of the girl's warnings not to be curious, that his beloved spends part of her time as a tiny dwarf. Torn between love and disillusionment and threatened with final separation, he insists upon being once and for all united with his beloved, even though he is warned that this will inevitably reduce him to the dwarfish size of his wife. They marry, but he soon regrets his hasty decision. He cannot forget that he is really a human being. Now, for the first time, I grasp what philosophers mean by their ideas, with which man is said to be so afflicted. I had an ideal of myself, and often in dreams I appeared to myself as a giant. In the end, he frees himself forcibly and regains human dimensions, poor and single as before. Few other stories of Goethe's are told with as much humor and charm as this modern fairy tale, and nowhere else does he represent so vividly the restlessness of the human heart, which, undisciplined and blind, reaches for the impossible, but which, reminded of its obligations, lends true dignity to man. By the excess of his passion and imagination, the young man is transformed into a dwarf. But by the same dangerous energies that reduced him, he is also symbolically restored to human proportions. If the natural and irrational, or as Goethe would say, the demonic impulse is the cause of his degradation, it is also the source of his moral regeneration. In the novelle 1826 to 1827, this central theme, not only of Goethe's but of all great art, is given profound and radiant poetic expression. We find ourselves once more in a world which, like that of Werther, brings nature and man into the closest relationship, and in which the high and the low, the naive and the subtle, are gravely contrasted. But no one will mistake the nearly complete shift in perspective which now produces a masterpiece classical in its formal proportions as well as in its view of the stature of man. Those elaborate tableaux and the magnificent but circumscribed vistas to which Goethe devotes so much of the novelle point to a conception of nature which is essentially civilized. They are the appropriate background for the delicately sketched action and the muted harmonies that resolve it. They are, at the same time, the plausible setting for a highly formalized social hierarchy, which, no matter how patriarchal it may seem to us, is here viewed as positively as it was deprecated in Werther. In this late work of Goethe's, man is able at last to cope with nature, but more than blunt force is required of him, and where he may believe to act most effectively, he will sometimes find his means ill chosen and inadequate. Honorio, though hardly the hero of the story, is nevertheless its central character. His love for the princess, stated in the most elusive fashion, is the pivot of the action. He alone is always in sight. He connects the various strands of the plot, only he experiences something like a psychological change. It is true that by his deed he averts an apparent danger, yet we are left in no doubt that given the ever-present element of danger, his kind of action will not suffice. His heroism is soon shown to be foolish and useless in essence. There is hardly a single incident in the novelle in which we are not made to feel the presence of an elemental threat to the precarious balance of human thought, feeling, and action. The individual by himself or in his relations to others must forever be prepared to meet this danger. And Honorio, brave, skillful, intelligent though he may be, has not yet recognized the essential duty of man. He has not yet mastered himself. The second part of the novelle demonstrates, in a symbolical and sometimes oblique manner, the lesson which Honorio must learn. You are looking towards evening, says the woman, perhaps suggesting the opportunities of America for the young courtier eager to prove his worth. And you are right. There is much to do. Hurry, do not delay. You will conquer, but first of all, conquer yourself. This is the meaning which Goethe himself in another talk with Eckermann wished to stress. To show how that which is unruly and untrammable can often better be overcome by love and piety than by force. The tiger and the lion point to what Honorio must master in himself, and the child represents true victory and conquest. The story ends not tragically like Werther, but on a note of conciliation and optimism. All tension is relieved, all fear banished by the courage and devotion of a simple heart. Goethe's intention in relating the extraordinary incident cannot be questioned, but it may be objected that his proportions in the telling of it are altogether puzzling. The final unfolding of the main event is prepared with an overwhelming assembly of detail, and the narrative is frequently retarded by descriptive and argumentative passages of seemingly little bearing on the crucial action. Actually, however, a close reading will reveal it to be a work of infinitely careful organization. In 1797, Goethe had thought of using the plot for an epic poem or a ballad to be called The Hunt. The eventual title novelle suggests the narrative in the style of Boccaccio or Cervantes, yet it is more in the nature of an anecdote than a short story, and it aims in the end at an allegorical and moral effect rather than at mere entertainment. To find a simile for this story, said Goethe, imagine a green plant shooting up from its roots, thrusting forth strong green leaves from its sturdy stem, and at last ending in a flower. The flower is unexpected and startling, but it had to come. The whole green foliage exists only for the sake of that flower and would be worthless without it. The style of the novelle is disciplined, and while anti naturalistic, it is objective and rich in realistic detail. The emphasis upon visual and pictorial effects, upon shapes, outlines, and deep colors, gives to it a wonderful solidity. From early morning, as the mists lift on a brief, serene fall day past the high light of noon, to the moment when the last rays of the sun illuminate Honorio and the child, we move in a frame of almost classic unity. At precisely the middle, the story gathers speed, its sculptured epic firmness turns into musical rhythm, and what began as a sober report of a hunting party ends in a marvelous scene of transparent poetry. Beyond the last sounds of the flute, there is no more to be said, no detail of fact to be added. What becomes of Honorio, of the company, of the lion? All these things, Goethe asserts us, are foreseen and therefore need not be said and elaborated. If they were, we should become prosaic. But an idea, a lyrical conclusion, was necessary. For after the pathos of the man's speech, which is in itself poetic prose, still greater intensity is required, and I was obliged to have recourse to lyrical poetry, even to a song. If in some respects the novelle reminds us of the architectural perfection of Poussin, its end, at once gay and profound, is pure Mozart. In theme and manner, it is the superb achievement of the classical artist who renounces himself, controls his intensity, and submits his instincts and his feelings to the idea of self mastery. For what, conclude conclude Goethe? Goethe's own thoughts on the novelle is the point of rendering reality. We are pleased when it is truthfully represented. It may even give us a clearer knowledge of certain things. But the proper gain to our higher nature lies in the perception of the idea which comes from the heart of the poet, Victor Lang. Ithaca, New York, January 1949. And mind you, this is 3 books in one. The Sorrows of Young Werther. I don't know if it's Werther or Werther. The new Melusina and Novelle. But here's the biographical and bibliographical note attached to whatever. I'm not sure what it's about. Johann Wolfgang Goethe was born in Frankfurt in 1749, and after a youth of brilliant creative exuberance, settled in 1775 in Weimar, where he assumed a number of high administrative offices at the ducal court, and where at the same time he devoted himself to a rich life of literary and scientific activities. The more than 130 volumes of his works, letters, and diaries reveal an incomparable variety of interests and accomplishments. He is, of course, best known for his dramatic poem Faust, of which the first part appeared in 1808 and the second after his death in 1832. But his lyrical productions, as well as plays Iphigenie, 1787, Tasso, 1790, his poetic narrative, Hermann und Dorothea, 1797, his novels and his autobiographical, scientific, and philosophical writings all testified to a mind of rare maturity. When he died in 1832, he was recognized as the most conspicuous European man of letters of the age. In 1855, the Englishman George Henry Lewes published the first comprehensive life of Goethe, which is still a useful biography in spite of obvious critical shortcomings. The most convenient summary of the data of Goethe's career and a judicious bibliography is contained in J.R. Robertson's article on Goethe in the latest edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Among more recent studies in English is Hume Brown's. Does it say Hume? Hume Brown? Yeah, Hume. Hume Brow's Brown's Life of Goethe, 1920. J.R. Robertson's Goethe, 1927, and two admirable books by Barker Fairley, Goethe as Revealed in His Poetry, 1932, and A Study of Goethe, 1947. Nowhere, perhaps, does the personality of the oldest Goethe emerge more impressively than in J.P. Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe, 1836-1848. A document of splendid wisdom comparable in kind to Boswell's Life of Johnson. For the present volume, the second version of Werther, 1787, has been used, and the translation by R.D. Boylan, 1854, has been thoroughly revised and in many respects rewritten by the editor, who has also translated the novelle. The translation of the new Melusina by Jean Starr Untermeyer is here printed by permission of Julian Messner. The Sorrows of Young Werther. Whatever I have been able to discover of the envy. Let's see when this starts, 41-ish. Whatever I have been able to discover of the story of Jesus Christ. Start over. Whatever I have been able to discover of the story of poor Werther, I have carefully gathered and here put it before you, knowing that you will be grateful to me for it. You will not be able to withhold your admiration and love for his mind and character, or your tears for his fate. And you, good soul, who are filled with the same anguish as he, draw consolation from his sufferings. And yet this little book be your friend, if fate or your own fault should not grant you one closer to your heart. And now I think we get to Young Werther. Book 1, May 4th, 1771. Thus why we're reading it, or I am reading it. How glad I am to have got away. My dear friend, what a thing is the heart of man. To leave you from whom I was inseparable, whom I loved so much, and yet be happy, I know you will forgive me. Were not all my other attachments especially designed by fate to torment a heart like mine? Poor Leonore, and yet I was not to blame. Was it my fault that, while the capricious charms of her sister afforded me agreeable entertainment, a passion for me developed in her poor heart? And yet, am I wholly blameless? Did I not encourage her emotions? Did I not find pleasure in those genuine expressions of nature, which, though but little amusing in reality, so often made us laugh? Did I not? But oh, what is man that he dares so to accuse himself? My dear friend, I promise you I will change. I will no longer, as has ever been my habit, continue to ruminate on every petty annoyance which fortune may have in store for me. I will enjoy the present, and the past shall be for me the past. No doubt you are right, my best of friends. There would be far less suffering amongst mankind if men, and God knows why they are so constituted, did not use their imaginations so assiduously in recalling the memory of past sorrow, instead of bearing an indifferent present. Will you be so kind as to inform my mother that I shall look after her business to the best of my ability, and shall give her news about it soon? I have seen my aunt, and find that she is very far from being the disagreeable person our friends make her out to be. She is a lively, temperamental woman with the best of hearts. I explained to her my mother's grievances with regard to the part of the legacy which has been withheld from her. She told me the reasons why she had done it, and the terms on which she would be willing to give up the whole, and to do more than we have asked. In short, I cannot write further upon this subject now. Only tell my mother that all will be well. And in this trifling affair I have again found, my dear friend, that misunderstandings and neglect cause more mischief in the world than malice or wickedness. At any rate, these last two are much rarer. For the rest, I am very well off here. Solitude in this terrestrial paradise is a wonderful balm to my mind, and the early spring cheers with all its warmth my often shivering heart. Every tree, every bush is full of flowers, and one might wish himself transformed into a cockchafer to float about in this ocean of fragrance and find in it all the food one needs. The town itself is disagreeable, but then, all around it, nature is inexpressibly beautiful. This induced the late Count M. to lay out a garden on one of the sloping hills which here intersect and form the most lovely valleys. The garden is simple, and it is easy to see as soon as one enters that the plan was not designed by a scientific gardener, but by a man who wished to give himself up here to the enjoyment of his own sensitive heart. Many a tear have I already shed to the memory of its departed master in a summer house which is now reduced to ruins, but was his favorite resort, and now is mine. I shall soon be master of the garden. The gardener has become attached to me within the few days I have spent here, and, I am sure, it will not be to his disadvantage. And that's the end of the first entry of The Sorrows of Young Werther by Wolfgang von Goethe. I believe that's what it is, Johann Wolfgang. Wolfgang! But that's it. I will be back on May 10th with the second passage. That's all, bros. That's all, bros.